Hello and welcome. In this video I thought I would do an update to the Death Guard buyer guide, as that one has been around for some time and it's become a little bit out of date, so I thought I would do a revision just to bring it into line with the year 2023 due to all the changes that has occurred since the release of the original and today. With that being said, let's take a quick dive into the background of the Death Guard forces. So the Death Guard forces are an interesting army in that they're not necessarily a particularly complicated army to play, though they do give you a lot of depth and a lot of interesting ways of building an army. With that in mind, what is the Death Guard playstyle? Well, the Death Guard are not particularly an army that exceptionally excels at any one thing, however they do quite a lot of different things quite right. One of the first things that people will notice about the Death Guard is that they're incredibly resilient, having generally a higher toughness than most other armies, as well as having an army-wide built-in damage reduction against different attacks in their disgustingly resilient ability. This does give them a lot of survivability, however they are a rather slow-moving army for the most part, with some notable exceptions, and that does mitigate some of their survivability in that sense. So do keep in mind, their biggest traits are that they're generally a kind of slow-moving army, and that they have very good durability. In terms of if they're a shooting army or a melee army, they're somewhere in between, though they definitely excel at melee a lot more than they do at shooting. One thing that they do lack is a good quantity of long-range firepower. They do have some long-range firepower in things like the Plague Burst Crawler and a few other options, but for the most part, they're going to want to be within about a 24-inch range of whatever enemy they're targeting. This can definitely make it a little hard, especially with their low mobility, though with that being said, their melee capabilities are rather powerful. However, at the same time, they're not as much of a melee blender army as some other armies are, due to their resilience, meaning that they have a lot of ability to put out quite a lot of damage, but they're not going to have as much damage as certain other armies, though they are going to have a lot more resilience. In addition to that, their contagion abilities do play into that melee aspect and close range aspect, as the closer they are to an enemy, the more debuffs they give to those enemy units, so they do gain even more benefit from being within close range of an enemy unit. So with all of that in mind, think of them as a bit of a bruiser army in that they do a decent amount of damage at a close range while being able to really diminish your enemy forces. However, they're not a glass cannon, rather they're a bit tanky in their own right, though they are a bit slow, giving them some vulnerability in that sense. More so, even though their lore would suggest that they hated psychic powers, they do have psychers within their army. However, their psychic abilities are not as prevalent as certain other armies, such as the Grey Knights for the Imperium or the Thousand Sons for the Chaos Forces. As such, this makes the Death Guard kind of a jack of all trades, and not necessarily a master of any, but you can definitely skew lists to play in one way or another. This definitely gives them a lot of ability and flexibility to kind of be an interesting army. All in all, I would say the Death Guard are not an army that excel at any one thing, but they do offer a very mid-range army that can be very fun and simple to play, or a bit more complicated, depending on how you want to build them. So with that being said, let's take a quick look into the lore of the Death Guard. The Death Guard were led by their Primarch Mortarion, who was an avid hater of different psychers and for the most part viewed psychers as a very negative thing due to his upbringing on a planet where necromancers ruled and oppressed him and his people in ways that are very unspeakable. However, what happened with the Death Guard forces is that Mortarion's second in command, Typhon at the time, betrayed his battle brothers and made a deal with Nurgle. And as such, the Death Guard were trapped and had to bargain with the Chaos Forces in order to survive as a legion. Now one might wonder, why would anyone choose to follow the forces of Nurgle as the Death Guard do? The easiest explanation is that while you're turned into a festering bloated monstrosity, you do gain a lot of benefits as all of the pain that you feel goes away and you feel a loving embrace of Grandfather Nurgle. As such, while you may appear monstrous and horrific to the outside world, inside you'll feel rather great and gleeful. This is why Poxwalkers will often have a demented smile on their face as they shamble into battle, ready to fight their enemy opponents. And being plague carriers, the Death Guard are incredibly horrifying as they're nearly immortal within the lore, and that's why their resilience is so represented within the tabletop game. And not only that, but they're also spreaders of disease and plague, so when fighting against them, you're very likely to become infected and eventually turn into a Poxwalker yourself. Hence why they have different contagion abilities, and they favor being more close and personal with their enemy forces. As such, the Death Guard are an incredibly terrifying and nightmarish force for any world to face against, and most enemies would rather put an end to themselves than be slowly infected and succumb to the horrors of the Death Guard forces and their patron Nurgle. In any case, that's just a brief overview, and we can continue on with a look into the buyer's guide of this video. One good thing about having a rather elite army such as Death Guard is they're not necessarily an expensive army to build, though they can be rather expensive depending on which models you choose. So that being said, let's take a look at the combat patrol as we do with most armies that we cover. And before we dive into that, if you're interested in buying a combat patrol, do visit the link in the description down below to the web store, or simply visit venturetradeco.com for all of your different hobby needs, as you'll get a 15% discount, bringing that combat troll down to $127.50 if you're within the United States, which is where venturetradeco.com ships to. And if you buy from that web store, you'll be supporting the channel and helping out content such as this. Anyway, with that being said, let's return to our regularly scheduled content. The combat troll would cost you $150 if bought at Games Workshop prices. However, it can be found at that 15% discount as mentioned before. So what does the combat troll include? Well, the first thing it includes is an HQ choice known as Typhus. Typhus is a Lord of Contagion with some additional upgrades, and if you bought him individually, he would cost you $42, which is an absolutely absurd price for an individual model. Even $30 is rather expensive for a single model, and as such, the $42 price tag is a little bit absurd. As such, if you do plan to buy a Typhus, definitely look into a combat troll, as we'll see it's a really good value, even without him in consideration. The next kit you get is a unit of 7 Plague Marines, which is a full kit, as they come in units of 7 and not 10 for whatever reason. This unit of Plague Marines will cost you $55 if bought individually. The next 3 kits you get are 3 kits of 10 Poxwalkers each, and 10 Poxwalkers would cost you $35 for that unit of 10, so this comes out to a total value of $105. And the final unit you get is a Biologus Putrefier, which would cost you $32 if bought individually. Once again, it's rather expensive to buy individual models, which is a bit of a shame. In total, if you bought everything individually within this kit, you would spend a total of $234, which would be rather expensive. Now let's talk about the value of this combat troll. When this combat troll originally released, it wasn't that exciting, as the Plague Marines were not that exciting, Typhus was not particularly amazing either, and the Biologus Putrefier was very much a fringe pick. However, time has gone on, the Biologus Putrefier definitely started to see significantly more play, and the Plague Marines are now very common within different lists, as all of their different war gear is free instead of costing points. This has definitely made the Plague Marines a lot more attractive, and has definitely increased the value of this combat troll. Not only that, but Typhus has definitely been seeing a lot more play, though he isn't necessarily the most popular HQ choice in himself. However, that being said, if you want, you can always convert him into a Lord of Contagion by simply cutting down his scythe weapon and replacing it with one that looks more like an axe. That would give you a more generic HQ choice, but I would definitely recommend keeping him as a Typhus due to the outrageous dollar price that he would cost being bought individually. That being said, if you do buy 2 individual combat troll kits, that's definitely something you can do with the Typhus. And the reason you would consider buying 2 different combat troll kits is a lot of times you would want those additional Plague Marines, and you can definitely find lists that run 40 to 60 Poxwalkers within them, so there's definitely justification for considering the combat troll in that sense. And unfortunately, the Biologus Putrefier would be a bit of a redundant inclusion, though at least you get a decent enough value buying 2 of these kits. Though that being said, I would definitely consider buying other options before buying 2 combat trolls, as they're not necessarily the most exciting thing. One thing I'll also mention is that the combat troll is technically an illegal battle force, as you can only include a maximum of 20 Poxwalkers within a unit, and you can only include a maximum of 1 Poxwalker unit per unit of Terminators or Plague Marines within an army. This means that 10 of those Poxwalkers are not usable within an army consisting of only the models found within the combat troll box. However, this isn't the biggest deal, as the Poxwalkers are a rather cheap unit in points, and you'll still get your value out of this combat troll box. And on top of that, you'll definitely want Poxwalkers in large quantities at one point or another, so do keep that in mind. The individual value of those Poxwalkers and Plague Marines is $160 by itself, so they definitely justify the price of the combat troll itself. And do remember, if you want the combat troll at a 15% discount, or any of the other model kits discussed here, visit venturetradeco.com to get that discount if you live within the United States, as that's the only place we ship to. In any case, let's move on to the next section, which is units you should consider buying first if you don't want to buy the combat troll, or if you just want some additional items in addition to your combat troll and you're just starting out. There's actually quite a few different units you can consider early on when starting out a Death Guard force, as they do have a lot of interesting options. The first unit you might want to consider buying is the Chaos Demon Prince. This wouldn't be the new model kit, but actually the old Demon Prince model, which would cost you $50, and it's significantly less expensive than the new release of the Chaos Demon Prince. This is a nice HQ inclusion that can be really powerful within a small list and would cost you about the same amount of points as a Typhus. This gives you a little bit of an alternative when considering different HQ choices if you want to buy individual kits instead of the combat troll. Another kit you might consider is the Foetid Bloatrone. The Foetid Bloatrone would cost you $55, and it comes with a couple different options, whether it's ranged weapons or melee weapons. Though what makes the Bloatrone a very interesting inclusion is that it's actually a very mobile unit, which can definitely compensate for the slow mobility of the Death Guard forces. And it's actually rather powerful within melee thanks to its flesh mower attachments. Not only that, but it does allow you to play around with contagions, as its quick speed allows you to get into range of an enemy unit and use something like Flash Outbreak to duplicate Special Play Company contagions, or you can just utilize the regular contagions that it has in order to debuff enemies so that your other units can shoot at them before you go into melee combat with that enemy. Another vehicle you can consider early on is the Mephitic Blight-hauler. The Mephitic Blight-hauler does come with some heavy firepower and has a rather decent mobility considering it's a Death Guard unit. Not only that, but it's surprisingly inexpensive at only $27 for the kit. This definitely makes it a nice way to start up an army, considering that Blight-hauler is over 100 points, making it easy to really build out an army rather quickly, up to 1,000 or 2,000 points by including Blight-haulers, and it's a rather inexpensive option in comparison to some other armies that you would consider building in other factions. Continuing on with the vehicle theme, we come to yet another vehicle that you could consider buying early on, which is the Plague Burst Crawler. The Plague Burst Crawler is a bit of a unique vehicle within the Death Guard forces, as it does offer you some long-range firepower that the Death Guard normally lack in a rather decent quantity at a very reasonable points cost. As such, the Plague Burst Crawler is a very common inclusion within different Death Guard army lists, and you'll see 1, 2, 3 of them featured within those different lists. It's also a very resilient tank that can be very difficult for your opponents to clear out. As such, it's definitely something Death Guard players should consider early on, as the price isn't too bad at $70 and it can really fulfill a unique inclusion within your army. Now, 2 other kits that you would probably consider early on and are very popular within Death Guard forces. These 2 kits are the Death Shroud Terminators and the Blight Lord Terminators. Both these are just very powerful units, with the Death Shroud Terminators being a very powerful melee unit that can also deal with swarms and elite units very effectively once it gets into close range of those units. The Blight Lords also have very good melee capabilities, however, they're not quite as melee focused and have access to long-range firepower. Both these Terminator units are very good, and the Blight Lords definitely saw a bit of a buff recently, as now their war gear is free as well. As such, it's kind of up to you which one you decide to include with your army, and both do see play next to one another. However, I will say the Death Shroud Terminators are a little more popular than the Blight Lords are at this current time, but that does change as different rules change, and the Death Shroud Terminators do tend to be a little more expensive in terms of dollar cost than the Blight Lord Terminators. Anyway, it's up to you which one you choose, and both of them are very good units and are very powerful on the tabletop. And now we come to a section of models that you might want to consider buying, but there's a reason you might want to hold off on them as well. The first of these models is the Foul Blight Spawn and the Tallyman. Both these models are incredibly powerful and have incredibly good applications within the game itself. So why would you put these models in this category considering their power level? Well, as mentioned before, these are individual models and each of them would cost you $32 by themselves. This is actually a rather expensive price point, and this can be rather expensive for a new player just starting out, considering that you can get significantly more models and significantly more for that $32 price tag. If you're not very concerned about your spending budget, these are definitely very good inclusions and ones you should definitely consider, as they're very powerful models. However, you can definitely try to convert them out of some other models within your force. Another kit you might want to consider early on, but not necessarily purchase, is the Plague Marine kit. The Plague Marine kit is definitely a decent inclusion, and the Plague Marines are definitely very powerful now that they get all of their war gear for free. However, because of their inclusion within the Comm Patrol and the value that the Comm Patrol offers, there's definitely more consideration to buy the Comm Patrol early on, though if you need additional Plague Marines or simply don't want to include any Poxwalkers within your army, then the Plague Marine kit is definitely a perfectly fine purchase to make early on when building out a Death Guard force. It's just one of those things that you kind of want to consider what your other options are before purchasing it specifically. Another vehicle that you might want to consider, but not necessarily buy early on, is the Chaos Space Marine Rhino. This is pretty much the only generic vehicle out of the Chaos Space Marine forces that is a good inclusion early on, though the only reason I wouldn't rate it higher as an early purchase is because the Death Guard are a relatively expensive army in terms of points cost, so the Rhino can be a little bit of a challenge to include within a 500-point army or even within a 1,000-point army when you try to include some of your different options. As such, the Rhino is definitely a better inclusion once you're ready to expand your army and you feel like you need a transport for your different Plague Marine units. But until that point, you're better served focusing on other models until you're ready to include that Rhino and feel like you need it within your army. One other kit you can consider early on, but you should probably avoid until you're a little further along, is the Demon Primarch Mortarion. Mortarion is definitely a very decent unit and does see play within different various Death Guard forces, and he can definitely be a monster on the tabletop. Not only that, but he's a rather cool model. However, the reason I put him in this category is that he's actually rather expensive in points. And as such, if you're just building out a 500-point army, he's pretty much unplayable in that 500-point range, and even at 1,000 points, he does become rather expensive and eats up almost half of your army. As such, it's best to wait until you already have 1,000 points or more for your Death Guard forces in different models. However, that being said, if you're buying a 2,000 point army right off the bat, he's definitely something you should consider, as he can definitely be a decent inclusion within a Death Guard army. That being said, even then he's a big commitment, so do consider your different options and if you want to go with other models instead. In either case, that's my reasoning on Mortarion specifically. With that being said, we can move on to what things you should definitely avoid when building a Death Guard force. The first thing you should generally avoid when building out a Death Guard army is any of the generic Chaos Space Marine vehicles, except for that Rhino as mentioned previously. Even though a lot of these saw a reduction in points, things like the Predator and the Land Raider are generally going to be a little weaker than the other choices that you have within the army. For example, the Plagueburst Crawler is in most cases going to be better and significantly more resilient than something like a Predator tank. However, you might consider things like the Defiler, Hellbrute, and even the Land Raider, but for the most part, you're just going to have better choices within the unique units, and as such, you're generally going to be better off with those instead. Another thing to avoid early on are the folded variants that are a little bit too weak and don't really see any play. These are things like the Plague Surgeon and the Noxious Blightbringer. There might be some situations where you do consider playing these, but generally that's going to be once you've gotten to a more advanced level, and as such, I'll just avoid these until you think you necessarily need them or want to try them out, but they're kind of expensive models, and they're not going to be as good as something like the Foul Blightspawn or the Tallyman or even the Biologist Putrefier. And speaking of things like Biologist Putrefier, the other thing you should probably avoid is anything you can find within the Comm Patrol. This means things like Typhus, the Biologist Putrefier, and the Poxwalkers themselves. The reason being is that you can buy all these things at a significant discount within the Comm Patrol, so buying them individually doesn't really make much sense, especially considering how absurdly expensive Typhus is in terms of dollar cost. Though that being said, there are situations where you already have a bunch of the other models and don't want to buy a Comm Patrol. You can definitely buy some of these kits standalone, especially if you bought something like the Comm Patrol and you just want to bring up your forces to 40 Poxwalkers for future use. Though that being said, once again, do consider buying 2 Comm Patrols as the value is definitely there. Finally, one last thing you want to avoid early on, and this is definitely something you just don't want to buy, is the Warzone Caradon books. The reason for that is the Army of Renown within the Warzone Caradon books has become obsolete along with the other rules within the Warzone Caradon book. As such, these different supplementary books should only be bought for collection purposes or for narrative play if you want them for that situation. And with that being said, that pretty much wraps up with the general overview of the Death Guard forces. Remember, if you're looking for model kits at a 15% discount within the United States, do visit venturetradeco.com, and as always, thank you for watching, have a great day, see you next time, bye.